Hello, everyone. My name is Zach, and this is Science Explosion at Hudson Public Library. Now, before we get started, I want to show you the results of last week's experiment. So look away if you don't want to see it, but this was the walking water experiment, and it is right behind me. So you can see that the water traveled into the empty glasses in there. So I think that's pretty neat. Just wanted to keep that up until I was able to get that on the next video. All right, so on to this week. So this week, we're going to be talking about germs. All right, so I know germs are on a lot of people's minds right now. So what even are germs? So germs are little tiny things. We can't see them for the most part. I'll get into that. But even though they're so tiny, they have a big effect on our world. And there are actually more of them than there are of us. If you were to weigh all of the microorganisms on Earth, so organisms or things that are alive, mostly, I'll get to that too, and micro means small. If you were to weigh them all compared to the weight of all the big things like us, plants, animals, there's more of them than there are of us. So they have a big effect. So some of them are good, some of them are bad. Most of them are pretty much neutral to us. So the ones that we call germs are usually because they're not good for us. So what are they? So there are four main types of germs and then a couple other ones that I want to talk about. So bacteria is the big one. Those are one-celled creatures, and they are a fully functioning organism, so that means they can exist. So they eat other things, but they get their nutrients and their water from the environment. The main one that I'm sure is going to be on everyone's minds right now is a virus. Now, here's the thing that you might not realize about viruses. They are not alive. All right, so that might strike some people as a little bit weird, but they're not alive. So they don't fit the definition of life, and they can't exist without a host. So that means they can't exist without being inside of something else. That's why when people talk about how long a virus lives on a certain surface, that's because it can't live being outside of something else, like a human or an animal. So they're tiny, they're really, really simple, and they're so simple, they can't even reproduce without being inside of something else. So that's why if you've got the virus sitting on the surface, it can last a little bit on those surfaces, but eventually it's going to die out. Now, if it's lucky, it'll get picked up by you or someone else. And then if you so if I were to slide my finger across this table and then lick that finger, that would be a way that it would get inside of me. As long as it's on my skin, it's not going to hurt me. But as soon as it gets inside of me somehow, so if I touch my mouth, my nose, my eyes, or even into my ears for some types of infections, that's enough. So you got to be careful with that. So a virus, their goal is always going to be to get inside of something else. Now, some bacteria can live just fine outside of people. They can live in any sort of environment. But now bacteria, I think, are really interesting. I'm going to jump back to those real quick because not all of those are bad, and by a long ways. So hopefully this doesn't freak too many people out, but you have tons of bacteria inside of you. Not literally tons, but actually, I don't remember the exact numbers on it, but there's more bacteria inside of you than there is of you. And a lot of it lives inside of your guts, and it actually helps you. Some of it's just kind of sitting there not doing much of anything for you, but most of that is actually helping you to eat things. So if you were to try to eat, say, an apple, and you didn't have any of those bacteria, you wouldn't get nearly as much of the nutrients or the things that your body needs from it without them. So I think those ones are really neat, but there are some that are very bad for you, some bacteria that are very bad. So you've got things like pneumonia is one. Cavities are actually caused by a bacteria in your mouth. Bacteria are usually the things that give you sore throats. You could get strep, or if it gets really bad, tonsillitis. They can cause ear infections. So those are an interesting one. All right, we've got protozoa. So I'm not going to talk much about those because those just don't get as much media anyway. And so they are a one-celled organism like the bacteria. And they generally, so generally means usually, so they usually spread through water. So if you hear any news reports about an area that doesn't have clean water and people are getting infections, and infections are when a germ hurts you, that's usually because of a protozoa, although it could be because of a bacteria or a virus. But then we've got the most interesting one, I think. So that is fungi. And fungi is the plural of fungus. And that probably sounds familiar. So things like mushrooms are a type of fungus, but a lot of fungus is going to look like mold. And so mold is a type of fungus, and you will see it on food that is going bad. So it's especially easy to see it on bread. And I have a jar with some fungus in it here. I am not going to open it up, but it's a clear jar, so you should be able to see this. So I will let you know this was a carrot top and the bottom of one of the roots, and I left it in this jar, and you can see it looks pretty darn gross. So there are at least 7 different kinds of fungus growing in this jar. A few really interesting ones. You can see that one that almost looks like a really old person's beard. You can see these ones that look like fuzz, almost like lint. You can see these ones that have completely coated the root part here. So it's especially important for me to not open this up because of how fungi work. So they're a little bit different than some of these other ones, in that the main way that they spread is through the air, and they do that through spores. So think about spores as being kind of like seeds. They're not quite seeds, but imagine how if you're looking at a dandelion, it's got those seeds that when you blow on them, they fly through the air. That's sort of like how spores work. So spores, and this is the way that mushrooms reproduce too. One of the ways mushrooms reproduce. Mushrooms are really strange. Is through they have these tiny, tiny spores flying through the air. And you can't really see them without a microscope. But when they land on something and it's the right kind of environment, then they can keep growing. So what do spores like? And what does fungus like? Well, they love moisture. So that's why you'll see, if you take a walk through the woods, the places you'll see the most mushrooms growing are going to be places where there's lots of moisture. What else do they like? They like decay. So mushrooms grow on things that are decaying. Now, sometimes you'll see them on live trees too, but a lot of times you'll see them on fallen trees, on bark of stumps, on the ground around trees, trying to get things from things that are decaying. And so that's why it's growing so well on these parts of a carrot, is because this carrot is decaying in here, and it's got the perfect environment for that to grow. So that's a little bit of what that needs. Now, some of these other ones are really similar too. So bacteria are going to need the water and the nutrients. So viruses are going to need the water, and they're going to need a host to get their nutrients and their way to get more of them. So they'll want to copy themselves inside of you. So if you get sick with something that's a virus, then it's going to copy itself inside of you using you. All right. So, and a quick note, I'm going to be talking about the things that you can do to get rid of those germs in just a bit. So I've got a simple little demonstration to show off here, and all you need for it is a glass or jar, some pepper, crushed ones, not whole peppercorns. But if you have whole peppercorns, you can just crush them. And some water. So what you're going to do, fill up your jar or a glass. It doesn't necessarily have to be a clear one, but I want to make it so that you can, if you're not following along, at least kind of see it the way I'm doing this. So fill up your glass with water, then take your pepper, and you're going to put some pepper in there. Bloop, bloop. I'm going to make sure I have enough. Give it a decent layer on it. It doesn't have to be piles of pepper on there, but you can see that I've got a layer of pepper on there. All right, so what's going to happen if I hold this up and I put my finger into the water through the pepper? What do you think is going to happen? All right, so this water in this experiment represents water, and the little pieces of pepper represent the germs that are living on that water, which is a place where germs love. So remember, all of these things need water to help them survive. So wet places, germs survive way better than dry places. All right, so stick my finger in, and what do you think is going to happen? My finger is absolutely covered with my germs. And then what's going to happen if I touch my keypad here? So if you're following along, I want you to, without making too much of a mess, go around and pick a couple things up. So I'm going to pick up this soap bottle. I'm going to pick up this bottle of rubbing alcohol. I'm going to pick up this bottle of hand sanitizer. I'm going to pick up this thing of pepper right there. Now, if you've picked them all up with your finger that had the pepper on it, I want you to take a good look at them and notice how many little pieces of pepper are sitting on them. So you can see some right there. Every single thing I touched now has those little peppercorns on them. So that was me touching my finger into the water. And you could do this with your whole hand, but there's no way my hand could fit inside of that. So think about if I touched this and it's full of germs, then this is all the germs that are on my finger. And those are going to be doing just fine. They can live there for quite a while. So then when I touch any of these things, like this jar, you can see now there are germs that have spread to this new location. All right, so how can we stop this from happening? Well, I'll show you one way. I need to wash this off my hand real quick. That should give you a little bit of a hint. All right, woo, hit the table there. All right, so you can see that I've got that layer of pepper on there. So I lost a few when I touched that. So I'm gonna put a little more on top here. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna rub some soap on my finger. There we go. So if you wanna follow along, do the same. All right, so now I've got my finger coated in soap. So now I want you to lift this up and stick your finger with the soap in it on it. Boop. All right, now tell me what happened. So what you should notice is that your finger with the soap on it, even though I had this absolutely covered in germs, you can now see that my finger with the soap doesn't have any of the pepper on it. So the way that works is that the soap actually repels these from getting near it. It acts as a barrier, and a barrier is just a longer word for a protection. Although I guess that is the same length of a word, isn't it? So you can try this at home if you want. Just sprinkle a layer of pepper. Don't make them too big, otherwise you're going to touch the pepper before you touch much of the water. But if you do it right, you should see the pepper literally scatter to the edges of the jar because it is trying to get away from that. So, all right, let's jump into, I'm going to wipe some of these peppers off of these containers so we don't just get pepper absolutely everywhere. And since this is just pepper and just representing germs and not actually germs, I'm not as worried about me leaving just a couple pepper flakes places. Mostly just makes a mess. Alrighty, so how can you get rid of germs? So there's a few different ways. So one of the ways that you can stop germs from spreading is to remember what germs need. So a lot of germs are really similar to you or me in what they need. So what do you need to survive? Well, you need to have water and you need to have food. And that's what a lot of germs need to have. So viruses are just a little bit different because they also need to have a host to live in. But think about that like what you need. You need to have a house or a bed to sleep in. That's keeping you safe and helping you to thrive. So if these viruses need to thrive, they're going to need a place for them to stay. And the most inviting place for them to stay looks like you. Alrighty. So one of the ways that you can stop germs from spreading is to take away the things they need. So if you want to have your food to have less germs in it, so food is a great place for a lot of different germs to spread and to thrive, especially bacteria and fungi. Now, if you were to cut up an apple, say 2 months ago, and leave it out, what do you think it'd look like now? Yeah, I bet you can guess that it would be probably not even mostly existent. It probably would have been colonized right away by fungus. It would be covered in bacteria. It would be pretty nasty. You certainly wouldn't want to eat it. Now, say I had coated an apple in a different science experiment a couple months ago in salt and baking powder, or excuse me, baking soda. What do you think that would look like? So it's still going to look a little creepy. And remember, I carved this into a face. Look at that cute little apple. So yes, I still have this. I've been keeping it in the same container of salt and baking soda. And this thing is still okay. It has not rotted at all. So why is that? Well, when I put it in the salt and the baking soda, it takes away the moisture from it. And without the moisture, then the fungus and the bacteria, they can't live anymore. They need that moisture. So here's another thing. So bacteria loves sugar. Like most living things, sugar is a great energy source for things. So you might be thinking to yourself, if I have a cup of sugar, why isn't that going to go bad? It can sit in my cabinet for months or even years without going bad. So even though bacteria love sugar and they would eat that right away if they could, they can't because it doesn't have any moisture in it or very little moisture, not enough for them to survive. Now, if you want to see how quickly they'll eat it, take a little container of sugar and put some water in it. It doesn't have to be all the way absorbed, but say you've got a half a cup of sugar, put maybe a quarter cup of water in it and leave that, and that will get colonized very quickly. All right, so what else can you do to get rid of germs? So soap is one of the ones you already saw. So what you can do for soap, if you put it on your hands and rub it together, soap is really, really good at getting rid of germs, and it's very good at getting rid of viruses because it actually helps to break them apart. So it takes off their protective layer. So think about it like the viruses are all wearing a suit of armor, and this is something that basically makes their armor come apart. So soap's really good as long as you get it all over the area you're trying to clean. If you only clean with soap on the front of your hands, but not the back of your hands, then it's not going to do anything for the back of your hands. You've killed all the little virus. And people always say killed a virus. So remember, it's not alive. When people say that they're killing a virus, it's just an easy way to say it. But they're getting rid of the virus on the front of your hands, but on the back, it's still going to be fine. So that's why it's so important to wash your whole hands. All right, what else can you do? You've got hand sanitizer. And I know you've seen all these things, but I think it helps to actually know why they work the way they do. Alrighty, so most hand sanitizers are made out of alcohol. And so that is something that will kill germs because it's what's called sterile. And when something is sterile, it means that other things can't survive inside of it. So we've got, related to that, is just rubbing alcohol. And this is going to do the same sort of thing. It's going to stop those things. So when alcohol comes in contact with germs, it stops them from being able to be alive. It basically just kills them. All right, and on a little bit of a side note, that is why we as a society are so interested in the properties of this. This is the properties of alcohol. Now, any of the kids watching this, you shouldn't just be drinking alcohol. You're way too young for that. But it's still interesting. So back way before water was consistently safe to drink, this is what people did to make sure that they could drink things safely. So the way alcohol actually works is it's also made from a tiny little organism. So it's done through a process called fermentation. And this is going to be the alcohol that you get in bottles like this. And even what you've got inside most hand sanitizers. So it's tiny little organisms are going to be eating part of the thing that they're in, whether it is water with wheat or grape juice or fruit juice or honey. All of those things are things that can be colonized by these things. And remember, colonizing is what these germs and other microorganisms do. So remember, micro as in small, organisms as in living things. Colonizing is what they do to go into a new area. So they can't colonize this slice of apple because it's what's called inhospitable. So that's a really great vocab word. Inhospitable means that they can't live there. So think about like the sun would be inhospitable to you. You couldn't go live on the sun because it'd be too hot for you. So just like that, they can't live there because they don't have any water. And so food preservation, we've used alcohol for that for a long time. Drying is another thing, whether it's with salt or just out in the sun, that stops things from being able to grow on it. All right, but our main focus here is not stopping the germs from getting on your food. We're pretty good at that as the day in which we live in, but I think it's still really important to know how to stop them from getting onto you. So if you were to squirt some of this on, rub it in your hands, and then wash that off. The soap, that's a really good one. If you do hand sanitizer, so remember what I said for soap, it's the same thing for this. If I were to rub my hands together like this, I've done a great job of getting all the germs here and here dead. But what about the back of my hands? I haven't done anything to those. That's why you see people rubbing their hands all over like this. Same thing for if you just use this alcohol. Now this is really good for getting surfaces though. Alrighty, so I'm not gonna bore you anymore with talking about those different types of things. But before I go, I wanna talk about a couple other germs that aren't quite as common, but I think are really interesting. All right, so we've got parasites. So I find parasites really interesting. So parasites, the word basically means that it has to, or that it lives off of something else. So if you think about what different types of animals mean, so you might know the word carnivore and herbivore. So if you don't, a carnivore eats meat and an herbivore eats plants. But there are lots of different things that things can eat. So a carnivore normally means that they will kill the animal that they're going to eat, or they scavenge it. But a parasite is something that eats part of that other animal or lives off that other animal in some sort of way without killing it, usually. Not always. So an example of that would be a worm. Now, not all worms are. An earthworm is not a parasite, so don't worry about those. They're not going to hurt you at all. But there are some that, I'll talk about the ones that live in frogs. So they're called little tapeworms. And there's lots of different types of tapeworms, but these tapeworms will get swallowed by a frog, and then they'll live inside the stomach of the frog, and then eventually they'll get out of that frog. It's a pretty creepy way to do that, but that's one type. There's also wasps that like to lay their eggs on top of spiders, so they're another kind of parasite. People do have parasites that get inside of them, and that's actually the big risk for if you don't cook your seafood well enough. There's other ways you can get it, but seafood's a big one. So if you were to eat, now don't worry if you see somebody eating raw fish. Sushi is perfectly safe as long as it's prepared right. But if you were to get a clam that's been sitting out or something like that, it could have a parasite on it, and it's going to live inside of your stomach. So most things inside of you can't live very well. Your stomach acid is, you might guess by the name, acidic, and a lot of things can't live in there, but parasites have adapted really well to be able to do that. All right, so then here's the last one, and I do have to warn you, this is the scariest one. It's also the least common, but it is the scariest. So don't listen to this part if you're a little easily scared by this. This is different than all of the other ones because it's not an organism really at all, but it makes things not work inside of you. So it's called a prion. And a prion basically makes the proteins inside of you not fold right. So that might not make sense. You might not know what that is, but just keep in mind that proteins are the things that are the building blocks of you. So proteins help you to have the structures. So without proteins, I wouldn't have a hand, I wouldn't have a head, I wouldn't have a brain. And that one's especially important when you're talking about prions, because prions usually like to go right into your brain, and they make the proteins in your brain not fold correctly. Now, we consider them to be germs, or at least some people do, because they can reproduce. So even though they're not really an organism, they're not alive at all, they are a protein that basically makes other proteins not fold right, and they can spread that. All right, so I said this is one that isn't nearly as common as these other things. So keep in mind, because these other ones are organisms, they're living different places. So bacteria live all over the place. Viruses are still fairly common. Protozoa are everywhere, and fungi are all over the place. So also keep in mind, fungi are everywhere. Yeast is actually a type of fungus. And if you know anyone who has started a sourdough, they are actually using a fungus to help make that. That is the yeast going into your dough. And if you want to try this yourself, it's really easy. Just mix flour with water and then let it sit on a counter. And when it starts bubbling, then you'll know that it's been colonized by those types of yeast. And they live all throughout the air. So there are actually spores everywhere. But okay, anyway, going back to prions. So prions are a little scary. Because of the effects they have, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but they're not quite as common. Now, you have heard of some of them, or at least your parents have. So the one that everybody was talking about a few years ago was mad cow disease. So that wasn't caused by bacteria or a virus. It was caused by prions. So it's not a very common one, but it does happen. It usually comes from what you eat. And that includes the other most famous one, which is caused by something you eat. And that one's a little creepy. And in case I have younger audiences, I won't talk about that one at all. But you can ask me if you want to when you see me. Otherwise, you might know the one I'm talking about. All right, so those ones, the effects of them are so creepy because they stop the proteins in your brain from folding right. And remember, I said that those are the structures in your brain. So it basically goes into your body and makes it so you can't build things right. So imagine you've got like a Lego set, and all of a sudden, and you had to build it from those instructions, and they go in and they make it so that the blocks can't click together right. Maybe those blocks, they don't have the little studs or the things that click together. So imagine if you were to try to build a Lego house, but then all of a sudden, all of the blocks didn't have the little studs in them, you're not going to be able to do it as well. That's kind of like what's happening to your brain. Those things are making it so that your proteins in your brain can't form the structures they need to. It's a really scary thing, but just remember that is not nearly as common as these other types of ones. Things like bacteria and things like virus are a lot more common. All right, so bacteria are the ones that are kind of everywhere, but I do want to say that viruses are the ones that people tend to worry about, and that is with good reason. Viruses can spread really easily. So let's talk about the one we've got now. I know I've made it a long way without talking about it directly, but the one that we've got now is the SARS-2 coronavirus, or COVID-19 coronavirus, the virus, whatever you call it. I'm sure you know the one I'm talking about. So this one is spread like a lot of different type of viruses. It can be spread on surfaces, but this one is also an airborne virus. And when people say airborne, that means it can travel on the air. So remember, I've talked in a couple different things in the past about how when you breathe, people like to think about the gases that you breathe. So you breathe in oxygen and out carbon dioxide. But when you breathe out, it's not just carbon dioxide you're breathing out, it's also little tiny drops of water. And remember what I said, viruses and bacteria they need water. So if I were sick with any type of virus, when I'm breathing out right now, those little viruses are going to be traveling out on the teeny tiny drops of water whenever I talk or breathe. So that's why we've got these masks. That is the point of why you have them, is because it's stopping them from getting out. The main purpose of wearing a mask like this actually isn't for my own protection. It's in case I'm sick with something and I don't know it, that it's not going to be going to you. So it's really a thing for other people. Now, it does offer some protection to yourself, especially if you're like me and you have a 3-layer thing. This is a cloth one with a layer here, a layer on the inside, and I have one of these ones on there. That does help you from getting sick yourself, but still the main point of these is to stop it from getting other people sick. All right, so I've talked a lot about different types of germs. So remember, germs are everywhere. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. Usually when we call them germs, though, we mean the bad ones. And when I say bad, I mean the ones that can harm people. So lots of other things can get germs too. So you might know that you can get sick. And if you've grown up on a farm especially, you might know that animals can get sick. Or if you have a pet, you might know animals can get sick. But also, did you know that plants can get sick? And this is a really easy thing to see. So whenever you're out looking, if you see a leaf and you notice that it has strange spots on it, that is because that plant is infected with something. Now, it depends. It could be a bacteria, it could be a fungus, or it could be a parasite. A lot of them are parasites. So I can tell you, and I can show you a picture for anybody who's interested. There are quite a number of plants around here that have a species of mite, which is like a teeny tiny little insect that likes to live inside the stems and in parts of the leaves. So plants can actually get sick just like people can. I don't think a lot of people realize that. All right, so if anybody ever has any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I am here at the library. You can always get a hold of us in person as long as we're open, and on the phone, through our Facebook page, through email. My name is Zach. This has been Science Explosion with Hudson Public Library. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Bye.